to CSEGuru. The next topic we will discuss under C programming is nested loops in C. A loop enclosed within another loop, that is called nested loop. That is, one loop placed inside another loop is called nested loop. Already we have discussed three types of loops in C programming. That is for loop, while loop and do while loop. All these three types of loops we can utilize as a nested loop. That is, a for loop can be enclosed inside another for loop, that is a nested for loop, or while loop can be nested inside another while loop, or even do while loop can be nested inside another do while loop, and vice versa. That is, even a for loop can be placed within while loop, or while loop can be placed within for loop. Similarly, while loop placed within do while loop, or do while loop placed within while loop, or for loop placed within do while loop, or do while loop placed within for loop. In any way, one loop placed within another loop, that is called nested loops in C programming. And if you are considering the syntax for nested loops, this is the syntax for nested for loop. So here we have used two for loops. So this is the outer for loop which is placed outside. Within this outer for loop, one more for loop placed inside. So one loop placed inside another loop is called nested loop, and here one for loop placed within another for loop. So this is called nested for loop. So this is the syntax for nested for loop. And if you are considering the nested while loop, one while loop placed within another while loop. This is nested while loop. Similarly, one do while loop placed within another do while loop. This is called nested do while loop. So, all these three types of loops we can use as a nested loop. So, although all the three nested loops, that is nested for loop, nested while loop and nested do while loop, are allowed to use as per syntactical rules in C programming, the most commonly used nested loop is nothing but the nested for loop. Most of the programmers prefer to use nested loop, in the sense nested for loop only they will prefer. But all these three types of loops are syntactically correct if you are using in C programming. So, any loop placed inside another loop is called the nested loops in C programming. Next, why we require to use nested loops? The first reason is when one task depends on another task. So, if you are considering two tasks, that is the first task and second task. So, if the first task depends on second task, or if the second task depends on the first task, in that case, to execute the first task, we need to use one loop. So, to execute the second task, we need to use second loop. So, anyway, one loop should be placed within another loop if we want to execute both the tasks. So, when one task depends on another task, we require to use nested loop. Similarly, repetition of dependent task. If the first task and the second task are dependent, for example, if the first task, if you are considering the roll number of a student, and the second task, if you are considering to print the marks in the sense, those two are dependent tasks. So, corresponding roll number should be printed and his mark should be printed. So, if there are two dependent tasks in the sense, those dependent tasks repeatedly we wanted to execute. For example, the first student roll number and his mark has to be executed. Next, the second student roll number and his marks should be executed. Likewise, all the student roll number and marks should be executed in that particular class. Means we have to use this nested loops only to print both roll number and mark. So, whenever the repetition of dependent task is required in C programming, that time we need to use two loops. To execute the first task, one loop we need to use, and to execute the second task, we need to use another loop. Similarly, to create patterns like primits in C programming. For example, if I want to print in the first row 1 and in the second row 1, 2. and the third row 1, 2, 3, and fourth row 1, 2, 3, 4. Likewise, if I want to print this pattern, to print this pattern also, we need to use the nested loops. The nested loops, so with the less number of codes only, we can able to print this type of patterns. Or if you want to print a star pattern like this. Any kind of patterns we can able to print with the help of nested loop by specifying the condition. So to print the patterns like pyramids, we need to use nested loops. And similarly, if you wanted to print multi-dimensional values in arrays. So this array concept we will discuss later in our videos. So array is nothing but it is used to store the similar data items. And if you want to print the multi-dimensional array values, for example, A of 1, 3. And if you are considering in the sense, this is a two-dimensional array. To print this two-dimensional array value, we need to use nested loop only. So this first value represents the row value and the second value represents the column value in arrays. So to print the row value, we need to use one for loop, and to print the column value, we need to use another for loop. So nested loops we need to use to print the multi-dimensional array values. So when one task depends on another task, or repetition of dependent tasks, or to print patterns like pyramid, or to print multidimensional array values in the sense, in that case, we need to use nested loops. And these nested loops will help to print the values easily with less number of codes. Next, working of nested loop. For example, here we have taken nested for loop. So if you are considering here one for loop, this for loop is placed within this for loop. So the for loop which is placed inside another for loop, that is called nested for loop. So here this for loop is called inner for loop. This for loop is called inner loop, and this for loop is called the outer loop. So first which for loop executes means accordingly the outer for loop will execute first. So when the outer for loop condition is evaluated to true means it will allow the inner for loop to execute. And we know the for loop will execute until the condition fails. Till that time the for loop will execute repeatedly. So when the outer for loop condition is true for first time, the inner for loop will be allowed to execute. And the inner for loop will execute repeatedly until its condition fails. So whenever the inner for loop condition fails, control will be transferred to the outer for loop. So this outer for loop, again, one more time, it will check the condition, and again, if the condition is evaluated to true means it will allow the inner for loop to execute one more time. Until this condition fails, it will execute repeatedly. So this process continues. So if you are considering here, whenever the outer for loop condition is true for one time, the inner for loop will be allowed to execute until its condition fails. So, which for loop exits first means the inner for loop every time it will exit first. And then control will be transferred to the outer for loop. Whenever this outer for loop condition also fails means control will transfer out of the both the loops. That is both outer for loop as well as inner for loop. Control will transfer to the next statement in the C code. So, this is the working of the nested loop. So, when two for loop is there in the sense, the inner for loop will execute based on the condition of the outer for loop only. Only when the outer for loop is evaluated to true means only the inner for loop will get a control to execute. Otherwise, whenever the outer for loop condition fails means the inner for loop will not at all execute. And the inner for loop executes inside the outer for loop. So this is the condition of the nested loops. And these are all the syntax for nested for loops. One for loop placed within another for loop. This is a nested for loop. Or a while loop placed within for loop. This is also nested for loop. Or do while loop placed within for loop. This is also nested for loop. Similarly, if you are considering the nested while loop, one while loop placed within another while loop. This is also nested while loop. Or a for loop placed within while loop, or do while loop placed within while loop. These are all the examples of nested while loop. Or nested do while loop if you are considering one do while loop placed within another do while loop, or a for loop placed within do while loop, or while loop placed within do while loop. So these are all the examples of nested do while loop. So if you are considering these nested loop, it helps to display the multi-dimensional data. So in this session, we have discussed what is nested loop, what are all the different nested loops in C programming, and why we need to use the nested loops. In the next session, we will discuss an example to implement the nested loop. Thank you for watching this video.